Is Andrew Basiago really telling about some of the greatest secrets kept by our government, that he was part of a secret time travel project as a child, that he had visited Mars with President Obama, or is he merely a liar? Andrew Basiago is a lawyer and supposedly was a journalist for some time until he decided to spend his life speaking about the truths of the time travel projects that he was associated with. Now, Andrew Basiago has gotten some media attention. I did a previous video on John Titor, who claimed to be a time traveler on internet message boards in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But Andrew Basiago has a similar kind of story, though he says that he does not believe John Titor's story because they actually have different ideas of how time travel works. But he has gotten some attention. He was featured on Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura. He also has been interviewed several times on Coast to Coast AM, which is, of course, known for all sorts of crazy conspiracy theories. And he was also featured on a television series called Weird or What with William Shatner, where he was interviewed and described some of the events that supposedly happened to him as a child. So he's gotten some attention, not an extreme amount of attention maybe as some other time travelers, but he has been in national media. Now, he got noticed especially in this last presidential election, as some news outlets took the story that he was actually running for president, and he claims that he is going to be president or vice president sometime between now and the year 2028. He supposedly ran in the last presidential election, though I'm unaware if his name was actually on any ballot in any state. I don't believe that it actually was, but he is supposedly now running for president in 2020 on what he calls the Truth Campaign, to tell the people of the United States the truth about time travel as well as alien visitation. Now, his story begins in the year 1967. Andrew Basiago's father was an engineer, and he claims that his father was involved in a government project known as Project Pegasus, and they were using technology developed by Nicola Tesla in order to transport people through space as well as through time. And there were certain travelers that went through time that were given a label of chrononauts instead of astronauts, and these chrononauts, children time travelers, went all different periods of time, sometimes far into the future, sometimes into the past. And Mr. Basiago claims that he was present in all sorts of really important past events, such as the death of Jesus, as well as the Gettysburg Address. Now, Andrew Basiago does claim to have a piece of evidence of his time travel. There is a photograph from the Gettysburg Address where there is a child that is pictured, and he claims that this child is him. Now, this child does look a little bit out of place. He'll mention various aspects of the story, that the shoes that he was wearing didn't quite fit, and that he looks a little out of place, that he was wearing more modern clothing than the other people around. And so he takes this picture as evidence that he is indeed a time traveler. Now, along with this evidence that he presents for the reality of the time travel experiments that he was involved in, he also presumes to have evidence of the fact that there is indeed life on Mars, which goes along with another part of the project, which involved sending children to Mars. And it is said by Andrew Basiago that people have traveled to Mars. We've made contact with alien life. We've been in contact with them for some time, and they have been visiting this Earth for quite a long while. Now, as evidence, he has written papers that were supposedly submitted to various journals on the subject of alien life, and supposedly he has proven that life exists through photographs that have been taken on Mars, and there are certain objects that he claims are evidence of civilizations, and he gets into quite some detail about exactly what those objects are. If you're interested in those, you can find those papers free online. Obviously, they were not actually published, and I'm sure the claim that he has is because they don't want the secrets getting out there, but you can judge for yourself as you're able to look at some of the evidence. Now, this is only a small part of the details of his story. If you really want to look into Andrew Basiago's story, you can go check out many of the lectures and other things that he's done, which are all available on YouTube if you think that he's telling the truth. But for the purposes of this video, I want to look at some of the reasons why this story might be a little bit doubtful. First, to believe in Andrew Basiago's story, you also have to believe in all sorts of other conspiracy theories, because this theory of Andrew Basiago is seemingly kind of a grand conspiracy that ties everything else with it as well, including UFO visitations, the other secret government projects, such as the Montauk Project, which also depends on the Philadelphia experiment being true. He also talks about Bigfoot, and he connects all of these conspiracy theories all together. So if any one of those conspiracy theories is not true, then Andrew Basiago's entire story falls apart. Now, we don't have time in this particular video to get into the details of it. We could do a separate video on it, but the Philadelphia experiment is very clearly a fraudulent idea. We know exactly who made the story up, and we know why. There is really no evidence that it happened at all. In fact, we have the opposite evidence. We have pretty conclusive proof that it was made up by a man named Carlos Allende. And as I said, if you're really interested in that, I can make a separate video on that as well. And the Montauk Project is an even more extreme and really bizarre conspiracy theory. It's one that's really interesting, and there are actually a few different supposed participants in that project that have come out. And so at least it is not just one person making those claims. There are multiple, but when you look into those claims, they are extremely fantastical, and there really is no reason to accept them as true. But Andrew Basiago's story has the further problem that it's simply his story. There is no one else to back up the evidence from this. There are no other people who supposedly participated in Project Pegasus. At least with the Montauk Project, there were multiple witnesses. In this, you just have the word of one man, Andrew Basiago, and you have to trust that he is indeed telling the truth. Now, if you're going to believe the story of one individual, you've got to have pretty strong evidence that that's true. And there are people from all over the place that have claimed all sorts of wacky things. You can look up the channel Apex TV on YouTube, and they have multiple interviews with time travelers, supposedly from all over the place. And all you have in those instances is somebody's testimony, and you have to accept it as true or false. And so if you look at all of these people claiming to be time travelers, they all have all sorts of different stories. And so the question is, which one is true? Because they don't all line up with each other. So why are you accepting Andrew Basiago's story above the others? And that's where we have the supposed evidence that we can look into. Now, the first piece of evidence that Andrew Basiago gives is this picture, and that one isolated individual photograph has gone all over the internet as he's tried to spread it, that this supposedly is a picture of him at the Gettysburg Address. Now, the first thing that you have to say when you're looking at this picture is just that it's really blurry. You really can't see very much at all. There is no evidence that this is indeed him. Now, if you had a clear face, and you had a clear face in another picture of him as a child, and you could compare the two, sure, you could make a case for it. But really, this is one random blurry photograph. The kid does look a little bit out of place, but you can't see any details. There are no details at all that what is happening in this picture is this is somebody that's dressed that is inappropriate for the time period. We've all probably seen that picture that's gone around of the hipster time traveler who looks like he's wearing modern hip clothes, but it's been demonstrated as you actually look at the picture and the clothing of the time that no, he was actually wearing clothes that were, appropriate for the time. And the question is the same here. How do we know that these are really modern clothes? If we have, a close-up picture that looks really good and we can tell he's got, Nikes on, hey, maybe that's saying something. But as it stands, the picture is extremely blurry, and it's really not proof of anything. I could just as easily look through a bunch of old pictures, try to find somebody who looks a little bit out of place, and then claim that that's me. That's all he's really doing here. It's not conclusive evidence of anything. And also, another reason why the story is extremely doubtful, besides the fact that the claims are so fantastical in and of themselves, is that he's never said something that happens in the future before it happens. Now, he's said things like, oh, I met the future presidents. I met Dick Cheney, I met George Bush, and I knew that they were going to be president, vice president. And he's only made those claims since those individuals were president. Now, he knew supposedly that Obama was going to be president, and he only recalled this after Obama became president. He was already speaking about time travel and all these other things beforehand. So if you really wanted to present evidence, why hasn't he come out and said anything specific that's going to happen beforehand. Instead, he has just these vague generalities like, oh, I was told that I was going to be not the president in the year 2020 or 2016, but that I was going to be either president or vice president, and it's between these years, because it leaves enough vagueness that you really can't test the claim. So that you just have to take his word for it. And every time it doesn't happen, you just think, okay, well, it just didn't happen to occur yet. Now, when Andrew Basiago was interviewed on Jesse Ventura's conspiracy theory show, they actually took him to the base that supposedly a lot of these experiments actually happened on. And it's pretty clear on the show that Andrew Basiago has no idea about what's actually at the base. He doesn't know his way around at all. He can't label anything there. And they're there for about an hour. They get so frustrated with him and with his lack of knowledge of anything that's there that they leave. So there's no actual evidence that he even knew the area at all. It's pretty clear that he's got his story very much straight. If you listen to Andrew Basiago, he's got a very clear story. He knows what he's going to say. He knows his locations. He knows the little details, and he knows quite a bit. It's a pretty well-rehearsed story. I mean, it's a lot of detail, and a lot more detail than some of the other guys that have been out there, which is why I think he's kind of gained a following when a lot of the other guys haven't, because, well, first of all, because he's a lawyer, so he's got, that gives him some kind of reputability. He's got a real education, but also because he's got a lot more details and a lot more consistency, I think, in his story than some of these other guys have. But even when it's really put to the test, he doesn't appear to know the facility that he supposedly spent all of this time on at all. Now, the other piece of supposed evidence that he has that he's telling the truth is these Mars photographs, which were mentioned. And as you look through the photographs on Mars, he claims that there are various creatures and people and evidence of towns and all of these kinds of things in the Mars photographs. Now, actually take a look at this. If you actually take a look at these pictures, they're extremely blurry. They're things that are far off, and there are some that do indeed look like what he says they look like. But this doesn't prove anything. It's part of human psychology that when we see things, we make connections. When we see things that are abstract, we make connections to things that are real. That's why we often see faces in things that don't actually have faces. It's why people look at the clouds and talk about the things that they see in the clouds. So our minds naturally make connections to things. And it's like the face on Mars, okay? Remember that picture that went around, years ago about the face on Mars? Now we take the picture from a different angle. It's pretty clear that it's not a face. And this is just how it is when we look at all sorts of things in nature. So naturally, when you have hundreds of photographs and you're going through them and you're seeing rocks and things like that, you're going to find something that is going to look like a real object on this earth. And unless you have a really clear picture and really clear details that demonstrate what that thing actually is, you can't just jump to the conclusion that, this is not a rock, it's a person. Unless you've got a really clear view and you've got pictures from multiple angles and there's some kind of evidence other than it happens to look like that. Now, Andrew Basiago also claims that he has written scholarly articles in defense of these things, and his followers have said that the only reason they haven't been published is because they're trying to hide the truth. No, I've actually read through the articles, and it's the farthest thing from scholarly work that you never see. I mean, it sounds like the ramblings of a crazy person. It just does. Now, I can say this. I'm working on my PhD right now. I'm finishing up a dissertation. I've published scholarly articles. I know, what a scholarly article looks like and what it requires. And this is just not it. I teach classes for grad students. And in those classes, if one of my students wrote a paper that had as little evidence as this thing that he had, I would fail them because it would be terrible. It would just be not acceptable. And that's just the case here. There simply is no evidence in any way whatsoever that Andrew Basiago's papers prove anything at all. So in the end, we look at all of the evidence. Yes, he's got a lot of details. Yes, he's certainly done his research. He knows his scientific knowledge well enough to tell this story. Now, does the science all make sense? That's another question. But he's got his story straight. He's got the details. But when it comes down to it and you look at the evidence, there's really no evidence that this man has been traveling through time, that he was taken as a child in secret government experiments. It's simply not there. Now, perhaps Mr. Basiago really did do all these things, and perhaps I'm totally wrong. Well, if he did, he's got to show some evidence that's pretty darn convincing. You can't make some extraordinary claim like this and base your evidence on a few blurry pictures and just saying, well, I sound trustworthy, so trust me. There's got to be more to it than that for anyone to take this guy seriously and to take his story seriously. So what's going on here? Is Andrew Basiago, is he making this up? Is he crazy? Has he come up with these ideas as a kid and now he, has really thinks they're real? I have no idea. I don't know what's going on. I don't claim to know exactly how he came up with these ideas. It's not really for me to say. But what I can say is when looking at the evidence, there is no reason whatsoever to think that this has anything to do with reality. Thanks so much for watching. Like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.